Hello and welcome back to State of the Division, this time bringing you UFC 314. And overall, this looks to be an interesting card on paper. It's a really interesting title fight for the vacant belt. You have Volkanovski looking to reclaim and Lopes looking to take it for the first time. Lopes, who had a really good year last year, taking a lot of fights and taking a lot of interesting fights and setting himself up really well for this year. And even earlier on the card, you have a lot of interesting things. I think Krylov Reyes is a super interesting fight. Getting Jim Miller on the card is interesting. I think that'll be a fun fight. And even on the early prelims, all in all, UFC 314 promises a fair amount. I'm really hoping it lives up to it. That being said, we've got the housekeeping and the butcher's bill. So let's jump right into those. So for the housekeeping, I went 6-4 in the last card. Not a great record, barely making it past 500. I don't want to say improve, but I do move to 21-12-1 on the year so far. Given that it was a 6-4 record and it's not great, I do want to comment on really what went wrong for me in my predictions. My biggest mistake was doing Morono over Lille. I put too much stock in Morono's veteran grit, and I think that really backfired on me. I should have looked more at Lille's finishing prowess and taken into account that he's been able to pull that out a fair amount going into that fight. Looking at the main event, which I also did get wrong, I did pick Pereira to win. I was really working under the assumption that Pereira would be a lot more aggressive. And I think in this fight, Ankalaev kept the pressure going forward. Ankalaev was able to manage the pressure really well and put Pereira on the back foot. I think I just discounted that too much and was very high on Pereira's ability to finish, his ability to put pressure out there. But when he didn't put that pressure, my game plan for him fell apart. For Ankalaev, he'll be a really interesting champion, and I'm really looking forward to his first defense. For the Butcher's Bill, as it stands at the time of recording, late at night, Jeff Neal and Carlos Prates are the only fights off the card. Jeff Neal took an injury. Kicking it all off, 8-2 Nora Wonder Cornolle looks for a third UFC win against 7-3, all hail Haley Cowan. Cowan is 2 years younger at 33, 1 inch taller, with a dead draw in reach. Cornolle is coming into her fourth UFC fight and seems to be a striking-focused fighter with 6 career KO wins to her name and 1 of those in the UFC. Numbers-wise, she works a 3.41 to a 2.81 in the UFC, with 1 fight ending in a finish. In the 1 fight she didn't lead, she drew in significant strikes 54-54 and only being down 7 strikes total against Cavalcanti. Obviously, she seems to have a finishing touch, but doesn't seem to do it in the first round often, instead working into later rounds. In terms of the ground game, she rolls with a .39 takedown average, with 1 landed in her most recent fight. She does have 1 submission win, but it seems a little like an outlier as it was in 2022. Cowan is coming in for the 3rd UFC fight of her career, a 2nd non-contender series fight. I'm gonna call her a grinder with both fights on the UFC record going the distance and having 3 decision wins in her career. The total numbers being 2 KO, 2 submission, and 3 decision. She does seem to work in the ground a bit more with a 1.50 average and at least 1 takedown in her UFC fights with about 4 minutes and 30 seconds of ground control in both of them. In the striking, she works at 2.97 to 3.17, which shows that she can be outstruck, but often will keep it close, and it is a bit of a grappler standard striking rate. Cornolle gets the biggest nod here, and I will agree. She just seems to have the better success in the UFC, which is a big marker for me, and she has a style that seems able to survive Cowan and her takedowns and keep that fight on the feet where she has the definite advantage looking how both of the fighters strike. So with all that being said, I'm going to pick Cornolle and I'm going to agree with Vegas here. 5-2 Mr. Vicious Trejian Gore looks to keep the streak rolling against 13-1 Marco Matuto Tulio. Even age at 30, even height at 6 flat, with the only difference being a whopping inch in reach for Gore. Gore comes into this fight looking like a submission-focused fighter with a solid ground game backing it up. He works a 3.46 average and has at least 1 takedown in 3 of his 4 UFC fights. With that comes some chunks of control time, but also a submission game, which accounts for 3 of his career wins, 2 of his most recent wins coming that way. On the feet, he has a grappler standard striking ratio of 3.00 to 5.88, with Gore being outstruck in 3 of his 4 UFC fights, only outstriking his most recent opponent by a single strike. Not sure about his striking power, but he does have 1 KO win in his career. Tulio is looking for his 2nd actual UFC win and 3rd win in a row. As a whole, I think I can call him a striking-focused finisher with 9 career KO wins and 2 of those in the UFC. He's a fairly dynamic striker with some explosive power that he can call on with consistency. Now, he does seem to be a relatively quick starter, with most of his fights only going into the first. He does have a 1.17 takedown average, but the numbers are a bit askew, with his only recorded takedowns coming in 2023 in his first Contender Series match, with no more recorded in the UFC after that. Heavy favorite is Tulio, and I will agree. It's a little boring, and honestly this fight might be closer than it looks given that Gore's had this recent run of form in the UFC. But the reason I'm rolling with Tulio here is that he has been the much more of a quick starter, capable of racking the strikes up quick, and we've seen Gore struggle with that in his history. And remember, as I mentioned, that Gore doesn't really outstrike opponents. On the feet, he's generally pretty outclassed and doesn't have the power to dig out of that hole as easily. So if Tulio can survive the ground or stay on the feet, Gore's in the hole there. He doesn't have the advantage, and the needle tips heavily in Tulio's favor. And given that he pushes the pace hard in the first, I'm going to give the nod to Tulio. I do have to acknowledge that Gore has a pretty good shot here, but I do think Tulio has the better odds overall. 16-7, Tibet Nigel Su Mudaerji, takes on 9-2 Mitch Raposo. Raposo is 3 years younger, 3 inches shorter, with a whole 8 inches of reach going to Mudaerji. Mudaerji has been on a skid as of late, but when he wins, his strength seems to be the striking. And while he seems to be a KO artist outside the UFC, he does only have 1 KO win in the UFC. In the striking, he works a 4.72 to 3.09, which does highlight how he has been consistently solid in the striking, only being outstruck once in his UFC career so far, and in his fights being able to rack up these large striking leads across 3 rounds. He has struggled with the ground game, with each of his losses seeing him being taken down at least once. In regards to the ground game, he works at .23 average, but only has 1 landed takedown back in 2019. Raposo is looking for his first UFC win, and stylistically is a finisher capable of putting it away on the ground or the feet with 4 KO and 3 submission wins. In the UFC, he works at 2.29 to 3.32 in striking, which has highlighted his trouble in getting his offense rolling. In turn, he has relied on his takedown, sitting at a 1.94 average to do much of anything. He's landed 3 total across his 2 UFC fights, though those are 3 years apart, with a small chunk of control time coming off of those. Vegas gives the nod to Mudaerji, and I will agree. My main thing being that Raposo just hasn't been able to gain traction in the UFC with his style or in his fights at all. And while Mudaerji's on a 3-fight losing streak, he's found success on the feet, and he's been able to survive in ways. Yes, Raposo shoots takedowns, but he's shot them so far apart, and I like to think that Mudaerji will at least be able to survive it on the ground and get back to the feet. And if Raposo can't submit him, I think Mudaerji's a better shot, because we've seen him fall prey to the submissions, but I don't know if Raposo can land the submission that he wants in the UFC. 10-2, Cedric the Reaper Dumas looks for 2 in a row against 19-9, Mikhail Hussar Olekseijczuk. Dumas is a year younger, with either 2 or 3 inches in height going his way, as well as 5 inches of reach. Dumas looks to be a grinder who slows the fight down and manages the pace by keeping his opponent on the back foot. He does a lot of work with his ground game, rocking a 1.31 average and having at least 1 takedown in all but 1 of his wins. Off those takedowns, he has racked up large chunks of control time that put his opponents down in the points and give him a solid lead and advantage. Even when he didn't land a takedown, he was still able to rack up 11 minutes of control time. He can be matched on the ground, like his fight against Friend, where he was taken down twice and lost by submission. Moving to the feet, he works at 2.15 to 2.03, which really highlights his ability to slow the fight down and keep everything in front of him. He has been outstruck a few times, but was able to use his ground game to take the control time in turn. Olekseijczuk is much more of a killer-be-killed striker, with some very solid stand-up. 5.08 to a 4.61 average in the strikes speaks to how he rolls with a fairly high pace in those fights. He's able to be outpaced, like in his last fight against Shaar Magomedov, where he was outstruck 97 to 77. Surprisingly, hasn't lost by KO in the UFC despite his fairly high pace and willingness to trade shots at times. He does have a bit of a ground game with a 1.08 average, though without a doubt it's very much a situational, them mostly showing up in his losses, with his only one in a win coming back in 2023. Olekseijczuk comes into this with a Vegas nod, and I'm going to disagree and roll with Dumas. My main reasoning here is that Olekseijczuk has struggled with the takedown, and fighters able to utilize that ground game to good effect. And Dumas is a fighter that does that and has been doing it in his recent wins, controlling the fight with takedowns, slowing his opponent down that way. We've seen Olekseijczuk struggle with that. Could he take control of the fight on the feet? Without a doubt, I think he can. But Dumas has the 5-inch reach advantage, and has been able to really work the ground game really well in both his UFC career so far and his last few fights. I think Olekseijczuk will struggle with that in this fight, so I'm going to pick Dumas to win. 29-11, Darren the Damage Elkins looks for war against 30-11, Julian Juicy J Erosa. Erosa is 5 years younger at 35, 3 inches taller with another 3 inches in reach, coming his way. Elkins is the long-standing veteran of this, with his first fight coming back in 2010. It doesn't matter to this moment, but it's still wicked, a 15-year fighting career. But stylistically, he's a grinder who excels in dealing damage and just grinding his opponent over those 3 rounds. His ground game is a major part of his style, with a 2.86 average and constant chunks of control time in these fights. Now, that can be negated against certain opponents, but on a whole, he's more than able to get that control time with some regularity. There is a small submission threat, mostly in the form of rear naked chokes, but it does feel entirely opportunistic. On the feet, he rolls a 3.40 to 3.22, speaking to his durability and willingness to exchange. Speaking to the nickname, the damage especially. Does have the ability to finish, but landing that does open him up to getting hit in return, which has gotten him finished as well. Erosa is more of a finisher, though he definitely has more of a preference for submissions in the ground game. On that same note, he tends to work a bit quicker, with most of his finishes coming in the first. In that vein, he runs with a 1.69 takedown average with varying chunks of control time, based on if he gets the finisher or not. However, he doesn't always need the takedown in order to get the submission, as he has been able to land the submission defensively or from a reverse position. He does have the standard grappler striking problem, a 6.18 to a 6.31, where he's more than willing to get hit in order to land his takedown or exchange. That being said, the 6.81 to 6.31 does represent a fairly high pace in the striking. He's proven the ability to hang on the feet, but obviously has been caught a few times and put away. Does have some explosive striking to Cowan, but as always, the ground game is very much his preference. Unsurprisingly, Erosa is the favorite here, and as much as it physically pains me here to not pick Elkins, I will pick Erosa. My logic being here is that while Elkins is good on the ground game, we've seen Elkins get controlled. We've seen Elkins struggle with fighters who bring a more aggressive ground game or a more skilled ground game, for lack of a better word right now. And that's what Erosa is bringing to this fight. He's a quick starter, taking the fight down to the ground and going for the submissions early, and that's what we see Elkins struggle with. We see Elkins struggle with these ground-focused fighters who take the fight there, slow it down more, and control it there. It's exactly what Erosa is. He's a ground-focused fighter. He takes it down. And while he doesn't slow the fight down, he looks to finish it quick and keep you on the ground in a position where he's in power. And if Elkins can't get him into a war and get him on the feet, I think Elkins runs into a problem and Erosa has the advantage. Opening off the prelims, we have 38, 18-0-1 Jim A10 Miller taking on the streaking 15-3-1 Chase the Dream Hooper. Hooper is 15 years younger at 25, 5 inches taller, with only 3 inches of reach going his way. Miller is the old hen here with 45 UFC fights to the name, and looking at them all, he's really been a ground-focused fighter through them. A grinder in some fights, taking control time and slowing it down. Then he has submission ability, and even in some cases landing a KO punch. Admittedly, that has only happened 7 times in his career. But starting with the takedowns, he works a 1.52 average and the ability to rack up control time off of very limited takedowns. He does seem to be able to play off his back, or at least survive with only a 49% takedown defense. He can be taken and controlled, but it is fairly rare for that to happen to him. On the feet, he rocks a 2.99 to 3.51, which is a bit of a standard for ground-focused fighters and is bolstered by some surprising KO power. Hooper, on the other hand, is a finisher with a definite preference for the ground and submission game, 3 submission wins in a row. In that regard, he works a 1.83 takedown average, and as expected, is both able to work the control time while also working for a submission attempt. He will throw multiple attempts in a fight, but normally has them land quick. Now, he can be taken down to control, but so far in the UFC, he has only been outpaced on the ground once and won that fight by unanimous decision. On the feet, he has been a little odd, honestly, with improvements in his more recent fights, but older fights showing some weakness and affecting the numbers. A 4.97 to 3.26 currently, with the last 2 fights seeing him having a striking lead, though he won both by submission. He has been caught out by power and pace, October 2022 seeing him lose to Steve Garcia by KO in the first, but again, recently he has been able to either neutralize it with takedowns or even have some success. The heavy favorite is Hooper, I'm talking minus 900, and against all sense, all logic, all reason, and by the verdict of pure favoritism, I'm picking Jim A10 Miller. If he has a path to victory, it's a bit of a winding one. It really relies on him leading the action on the ground, forcing Hooper to either play off his back or play from a defensive position, taking the control time that way. And while he could land a KO punch, and he has found that touch in his more recent fights, I don't know if that's the best way to bet on winning a fight, but it's something he could do. I do think Hooper poses a very large threat here. He's found the form on the feet as of recent, and on the ground he is younger. He is coming into this off a pretty hot streak as well, and I think he matches up with Miller very well on the ground and might be able to easily take the advantage from him. However, I'm very much betting on Miller's veteran experience, his recent run of form, finding some of that KO touch again, and kind of hoping for the old man magic to come through. Truthfully, this is a fight I'm picking out of favoritism and not so much logic and hoping to help my record. 19-4, 0-1, Xiaonan Fury Yan squares off against 21-3, Verna Kakara Jandiroba. Yan is a year younger, 2 inches taller, but Jandiroba does take an inch in reach. Xiaonan is a striking-focused fighter with a tendency to grind it out, but does have some definite finishability that comes out intermittently. In the numbers, she works 4.99 to 3.44 on the feet, speaking to her ability to push pace and dominate her opponents in that regard. In her last fight against Ricci, she landed 78 significant strikes to Ricci's 15. She does have finishability, as I mentioned, though her last KO did come in May 2023. I will say that she can be caught, but that is very much an outlier in terms of her record. Looking at the ground, she's a .92 takedown average, though the actual presence of her takedowns is a little inconsistent. It seems to be a matchup or situational piece, considering it only gets deployed against opponents that seem to outpace her on the feet. Fighters like Zhang Weili or Marina Rodriguez. Jandiroba is more of a ground-focused fighter with an emphasis on the takedown and control game. A 2.29 takedown average, speaking to the frequency of it and how important it is to her game. In most of her wins, she does tend to stack the takedowns. She does have some submission wins, but they are very sporadic, with her win in July 2024 being her first submission win in 4 years. On the feet, it's about the standard grappler striking with a 2.12 to 2.73 that lets her hang in and keep the fight close, but never really seems to gain a lot of traction, really relying on the control time to get the victory. Jandiroba is the Vegas pick here, and I'm going to disagree and roll with Xiaonan. Now, Jandiroba definitely has a chance. With her ground game and submission ability, that poses a threat in this fight. But the reason I'm picking Xiaonan is that we've seen her survive ground games. Maybe not dominate a fight in the same way, but she's survived them, gotten back to the feet where she continues to fight and continues to push her advantage. And in this fight, when we get to the feet, I think Jandiroba is very much outpaced there. Jan strikes at a higher rate. Jan's able to bring out more power. And I think when it comes to the feet, Jandiroba's in a pretty deep hole. So if Jandiroba can't get the finish on the ground, and we've seen Jan survive fighters capable of finishing on the ground, they get back to the feet, and I think Jandiroba's way behind there. 18-9, Dan 50K Ige looks to stop the skid against 13-1-1 Sean, the Sniper Woodson. Woodson is 1 year younger, with 7 or 6 inches of height heading his way, with a definite 7 inches in reach in his favor. Ige has been a bit streaky as of late, but stylistically is a quick-paced fighter with the ability to get the finish and occasionally win it by decision. Admittedly, he is coming off 2 straight losses where he was outstruck and controlled by his opponent. In the numbers, he rocks 3.66 to 3.50, speaking to his swing and bang style and willingness to wait into fire. This doesn't mean he applies constant pressure and never really feels out of the fight even when behind. The KO touch is there, but a little inconsistent with how it's shown up. It does have a .99 takedown average, but it can be stopped fairly often and is very much a situational piece with how it's been used. Woodson is very similar, with a high output on the feet and the ability to put fighters away. A 5.66 to 4.20, showing that he's able to work pretty quick and avoid some of the damage coming back his way. He seems pretty good at slowing his opponent down, with how the lead seems to sit around 20 strikes fairly consistently in his fights. Now, there is some sort of ground game with a .53 average, but it's very much matchup based and not used that often. He does tend to try and keep it on the feet with an 84% takedown defense, and historically, when taken down, he does tend to struggle a decent amount with the draw and loss in the UFC, both seeing him taken down at least once. Vegas gives it to Woodson, and I will agree. Woodson's a very measured fighter and can easily take control of the fight, and here I think he can take the pace of the fight away from Ige, get into a lead and put him in a hole, and Ige fighting from behind has been the problem in these last 2 fights. He's been down in the strikes and not able to pull it out in the end, and I think Woodson's going to be able to put him down in the strikes again and fight with a lead and just build that lead throughout. Ending the prelims off, 30-9, Nikita the Miner Krylov looks to keep rolling against 14-6, Dominic the Devastator Reyes. Krylov is 2 years younger, but Reyes takes 1 inch in height with an absolute dead draw in reach. Krylov is a finisher through and through, with 28 of his 30 career wins coming by finish, 12 KO, and 16 submission, with the majority of his UFC finishes being by submission, though the KOs aren't too far off. So starting with the stand-up, he carries a 4.38 to 2.47 with the ability to finish a fight quickly or take a striking lead to the end of the match. Most of his KO wins in the UFC don't read like power punches, instead more of that swarming style. But being willing to swing does make it possible for him to be put away. On the ground, he works a 2.29 takedown average and tends to work quick as well with getting those submissions. He's able to get control time and stack takedowns for a chunk of that, though the submission is definitely the preference. Can be surpassed on the ground and even finished with submissions, with losses coming against the likes of Paul Craig, Ankalaev, Teixeira, and Blachowicz. So it feels like there's a certain level of skill one must have to beat him on the ground. Reyes is a much more traditional swing and bang finisher, pulling on power and explosiveness to put his opponents to sleep. 5'6" floor to 3'5" on the feet, highlighting his ability to rack the totals up and even go the distance if needed. Not that he has since 2020, of course. Obviously, he can be caught by power or outpace, but it's hard to quantify that aside from just mentioning. He does have a .31 takedown average, but hasn't landed a takedown since May 2021 against Jared Prochazka. He does have some submission ability, but that also hasn't happened since 2017. Krylov gets the nod here, and I'm gonna disagree, and I'm gonna pick Reyes here. It might be a little bit of favoritism, but even though the Krylov is super dangerous on the ground and has that quick finish submission ability, we've seen Reyes survive fighters that can put him on the ground. We've seen Reyes survive on the ground, fight off submissions, and get the fight back to the feet where it really is his wheelhouse, and he's been able to deploy that power to great effect. And while Krylov definitely could knock him out, I think poses a threat on the feet as well, Reyes' power and consistency on the feet gives him the narrow edge there in my mind. Opening the main card. 19-5, El Pantera Yair Rodriguez welcomes UFC newcomer and former Bellator champion. 36-7, Patricio Pitbull Ferrer. Yair is 5 years younger, 5 or 6 inches taller, with 6 inches of reach, also going to Rodriguez. Rodriguez is the UFC mainstay here, with a definite preference for the finish, with his last 2 wins both coming that way. There's a definite preference for the striking with a 4.65 to 3.99. With that is the definite finishing touch with some explosive and dynamic striking backing it up. All of it posing a threat throughout the fight. He isn't mashed on the feet often, with it mainly happening when the opponent deploys takedowns to slow the fight down or Max Holloway fights him. That being said, he has struggled with opponents who shoot and land a lot of takedowns, Ortega and Volkanovski both using the ground game against him to good effect. He does carry a .69 takedown average, but hasn't landed one of those since 2021. He has proven the ability to reverse position or play off his back and land some submission without leading the action there. Pitbull here is the UFC newcomer coming over from a successful Bellator career. Comes in as a well-rounded fighter with 12 decision, 12 submission, and 12 KO wins, which is the only time I've seen that sort of spread on the stat line. So looking at the striking, he works a fairly dynamic style with clinch work seeming to play a part. He is coming off a KO win, but it is his first KO in 7 fights. Going to the ground, he seems to be able to work it fairly consistently and slow the fight down to put it in his wheelhouse. Not to mention his submission ability, though his last one came in 2021. Vegas picks Yair, and I will be rolling with Vegas here. It is a little odd given the lack of numerical stats I have on Pitbull here, but I'm going to work with the established style and what I know of Yair. And while I do think these two fighters match up pretty well, I've seen more from Yair. I've seen how he fights. I'm going to go with the known value here in the UFC veteran. I'm going to go with Yair Rodriguez. 17-2, Bryce Thug Nasty Mitchell takes the cage against 15-2, Jean Lord Silva. Silva is 2 years younger, 2 or 3 inches shorter, with an inch of reach in favor of Mitchell. Mitchell is without a doubt a ground-focused fighter who excels in taking the fight down, slowing it down, and then taking it to decision. He does have some finish ability, I do have to mention, with his last win being a KO finish over Kron Gracie. Sticking with the striking, he works a 2.31 to 1.53, which speaks to his tendency to keep the striking low and rely a fair amount of slowing it all down with the takedowns. He does have a KO win over Kron Gracie, but that is his only KO win in his career. I will say he does seem to have a decent ground and pound, but he keeps the striking fairly slow. Going to the ground, he rolls with a 3.39 average, which is very much his bread and butter, and a constant presence in all of his wins. He does have submission ability, but it is inconsistent with how it's been deployed. Last submission win coming in 2019. I assume he still has the ability, but hasn't had a matchup where the opportunity has presented itself. Jean Silva is very much the opposite, as a high-octane finisher who likes to push the pace and work quick. On the feet, he rolls a 5.26 to a 4.14, which does show he's willing to step in and exchange with his opponent. Normally does tend to lead in the strikes, but against other strikers like Drew Dober, he was fighting from behind, albeit 6 total significant strikes, when he pulled the finish out in the end. He is fairly explosive and athletic, though he can be matched in that regard. Looking at the ground, he rolls a .73 average, but hasn't landed a takedown since January 2024. He has overcome the takedowns before, but it does have a definite preference for the feet. The Vegas favorite here is Silva, and I will agree. Mitchell is dangerous on the ground, and if it goes down to the ground, the needle immediately tips in his favor. But on the feet, it's hard in the favor of Silva. I think Silva has the more explosive striking, the more consistent power, and the ability to push a pace that I don't think Mitchell will be able to keep up with. Silva has also proven the ability to defend the takedown decently, as well as survive the ground to get back to his feet. And if worse comes to worse, he has proven the ability that he can lead the action and take the fight down. If he does, Mitchell is still dangerous, yes, but Silva being able to lead the action might afford him a little bit of safety in that regard. For the co-main event, 23-9, Michael Iron Chandler takes on 22-3, Patty the Batty Pimblett. Pimblett is 8 years younger, 2 inches taller, within their 2 inches in reach, heading his way. Chandler is an odd duck to take a look at. He's an exciting fighter for sure, coming across as a kill-or-be-killed fighter with some explosive finish ability. But his success in the UFC has been limited. He's found some success with his takedown and control game with a 1.59 takedown average and some decent chunks of control time. But of course with that is the fact that against Oliveira he was taken down 5 times, and against good ground games he can struggle. On the feet it's a bit more wild, a 4.49 to a 4.30, which shows how he's been able to hang in and at least keeping it close in terms of the numbers, but he has been able to translate that into wins with close striking totals in his last 3 fights, with only 1 win coming back in 2022. It's not that he's terrible on the feet, but he has been able to finish the fight against the upper tier of opponents. Pimblett rolls in off a strong win over King Green and looks to be a ground-focused finisher with the ability to take it the distance. He's not super heavy on the takedown, surprisingly, with a .91 takedown average, and his last takedown coming in December 2023. He has the ability to play off his back or reverse position for submission wins, though. Obviously, he has been taken down in major chunks, but it's hard to tell if someone's actually able to dominate him versus him trying to set something up. But unlike other ground fighters, his striking is actually kind of solid, a 4.94 to 3.75. There are fights with very low overall numbers, speaking to his ability to slow it down with the ground game. Then he also has fights where the offensive numbers climb and force Patty to match the pace a bit, which he has been able to do so far. Vegas has a close in favor of Pimblett, and I will agree. Chandler has some explosive power, and Vegas has a close in favor of Pimblett, and I will agree. Chandler does have some explosive power in his striking and his takedowns. When you look at his UFC record, though, he really has struggled when opponents are able to match his offensive output. And I think on the feet, Pimblett's at least able to match what Chandler is throwing out. But when it comes to the ground, I think Pimblett has the major advantage. If he leads the action, he's able to really control from that position and set up a lot of stuff. And if he's on his back, he can still pose a threat, reverse position, and take the control time that way. For the main event and the vacant featherweight title, 26-4, Alexander the Great Volkanovski takes on the 26-6 Diego Lopes. Lopes being 6 years younger, 5 inches taller, with only 1 inch in reach, going his way. Volkanovski is still very much a well-rounded fighter who excels in adjusting his game plan to match up against his opponent. He finds ways to either counter their strengths or capitalize on their weaknesses. You see this especially with the takedown and ground control game. He sits on a 1.78 average, but hasn't landed a takedown since July 2023. But that has to do with who his matchups have been, that being Makhachev and Topuria, 2 very good ground fighters. But against opponents like Yair Rodriguez, who doesn't shoot takedowns all that often, he racked up 7 takedowns for 7 minutes and 13 seconds of ground control. I do have to point out that he can be taken down and controlled, though a 70% takedown defense does make his opponents work for it. On the feet, he is very solid, working a 6.16 to a 3.44 with some finishing touch. That being said, it does feel more like the swarming type of finish over a single power shot. Either way, he's been able to match up against most of his opponents, keeping it close on the feet, but he has been knocked out in his last 2 fights, though he did lead strikes in his most recent fight. Lopes is riding a hot streak and comes into this as a well-rounded, fairly high-paced fighter with some definite finish ability. Striking sits at a 4.20 to 4.11 with some serious power lurking in the wings. He has been in a few fights with low striking totals, leading to that average being a little wonky, but in all of his recent fights, he has taken the striking lead, and in 2 of them, he's been able to control the fight on the feet. Going to the ground, he racks a .50 with only 2 takedowns in his UFC career. He is able to rack up control time off landed takedowns and the event to get control time off defending opponents' attempts. There does seem to be a preference for the feet. I do also want to mention that he has landed a submission win in the UFC, but only 1 of those in 2023. Vegas has the narrow nod going to Volk here, and I will agree. Yes, he has had losses recently. Yes, he was knocked out pretty brutally for 2 fights in a row recently. But those 2 fights were pretty close together. He's had time off to recover, and I still think he can fight at this really high level and provide this really tricky style, if you will, where he finds your weaknesses and capitalizes them. And coming in against Lopes definitely has a chance to win. He has a blueprint to winning. The problem is Volk has a skill set that can interfere with that blueprint and cause a lot of problems. And we've seen Lopes struggle with some fighters before, not able to put them away or really pull away in the fight. And against Volkanovski, not being able to pull away, not being able to establish a lead or dominate the fight in some way, that means you can lose to him pretty easily. I don't know if Lopes is going to be able to pull away or dominate Volkanovski in any one way to either get the judge's nod or put the man away. So in the end, I'm going to pick Volkanovski. Well, in the end, after recording all this and going through it all, I'm still fairly excited for UFC 314. Overall, it's an interesting card from top to bottom. It has a few new fighters, a few old fighters, looking at you, Elkins and Miller, but overall it promises interesting fights with contenders and established people, and offers a lot of promise for the future in a way. This title fight's a lot of fun. Pimblett Chandler, I'm optimistic about it. I think it has a chance to be a really fun fight with a lot of action. I don't know if it will be that, but I'm going to believe it will be. I think Krylov Reyes is a lot of fun. I think the winner of that enters into title contention. And I just think all throughout this card, you have people on the brink of entering the next echelon of contender. And with a win here, they kind of put their name in that one more fight, now I'm a title contender, or someone gets injured, I'm a title contender status. With all that being said, tell me what you think down below. Tell me what you think I got right, what I got wrong, whatever else. And have a great fight.